Welcome, everybody. My name is Rick Rossow. I hold the Wadhwani Chair in U.S. India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Very exciting to host this event. This is the fourth time that we've actually done it, bringing together key ratings leads to look at the Indian economy. I believe by law, I'm mandated to say something along the lines of this is an inflection point. But really, there is a lot kind of swirling, both happening domestically in India as well as globally. That's, I think, going to have a big impact on this conversation and what we see in India in the year ahead when we take a look at the economy. India this year, of course, very proud of the fact that it's hosting the G20 as president, and a number of events happening all around the country, and some of those, of course, around the world as well. We were privileged to host India's G20 Sherpa a few months ago to get a preview. India's got multiple state elections. We're just over a year away from the national election. And I think what we've seen, too, a shift in Delhi in terms of how they approach trying to promote manufacturing industrialization a bit. Last week, also, we had the last full budget of the Moody government's second term, so I'm sure that'll come up a little bit in today's conversation as we parse some of the big statements, both in the budget as well as elements from the budget speech that were delivered to Parliament by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. Globally, the front pages still continue to be dominated by the war in Ukraine, increasing U.S. economic pressure on China. And the one question that continues to hang overhead as we look at COVID, is this really kind of the end game of COVID, or are we in a bit of a pause? What else could be around the corner? So a lot that's definitely swirling, but privileged to have three terrific friends and experts that are joining me today to kind of parse what's happening both globally as well as, of course, specifically happening in India. First, my good friend Joydeep Mukherji who's managing director of Standard & Poor's Global Ratings. Joydeep has been with the S&P for over 25 years, but real rich experience both in the private sector as well as journalism, and a consultant to the Asian Development Bank. Christian de Guzman, who's joining us all the way from Singapore, so late night for him. Thanks for making time at this hour. Christian, Senior Vice President at Moody Sovereign Ratings. Part of his decade-long time at Moody's, spent time in the private sector as well at J.P. Morgan, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, as well as the IMF. And to kick things off, because, of course, India does not live in a vacuum, is my terrific colleague here at CSIS, Ms. Stephanie Segal. Stephanie's a senior fellow with the CSIS Economics Program, and also has a rich set of experiences before joining think tank land a few years ago. Came to us from the Treasury Department, but also had great experiences at the IMF as well as J.P. Morgan. So first, I think we'll apply sort of the global lens, because, of course, India does not, as I mentioned, live in a vacuum. Stephanie, the floor is yours, and thanks for joining us this morning.
Great. Thanks a lot, Rick. It's a pleasure to be with you all again virtually. I do like this event because it's interesting to take kind of the global perspective, but then hone in a bit more on India. And I'm really looking forward actually to Joydeep and Christian's presentations. Let me just say a few words on kind of the global backdrop for our discussion. And that is, if we look at where we are now versus just a few months ago, I'd say the outlook has improved slightly on the global front. That's really a function of three factors. First, the end of zero COVID policy in China, and not a gradual end, but really a very binary decision on their part, and the reopening of the Chinese economy, very positive for global growth. I would say second is the fact that Europe has actually thus far weathered its winter and energy crisis, and looks to be coming out of the winter in much better shape than had been feared. So for sure, it is an energy crisis still in Europe, and they're definitely not out of the woods, but the worst case scenarios there have not materialized. And that bodes well then looking into this coming winter and their ability to, again, stockpile energy supplies. And then I would say the third thing is that the Federal Reserve in the U.S. thus far appears to have managed through this very delicate balance between containing and reducing inflation and not pushing the economy into recession. So I would say the jury is still out, but if you were to poll 10 economists, say in the fall last year, and what would be the ability of the Fed to manage to a soft landing, you'd maybe have 1 out of 10 think that that was possible. I think the odds are now, 3 or 4, or maybe even greater than that. So again, we're not entirely out of the woods, but the trajectory is good. And obviously, Fed policy has important implications for the global outlook. So I'd say globally, again, we're in slightly better position than we were, say, in the fall. And then if we were to just hone in a bit more on the transmission between global economy and then the outlook for India, I'm going to leave the experts on the Indian economy to talk about that. But let me say that India's place against this backdrop of the global economy, and Rick, you alluded to this in your introductory comments, it does feel different in the sense that India's place in the global economy, if you were to just look at the numbers, there's no question of India's importance and its prominence. We were looking back at some of the data going back to the global financial crisis, and India is the second fastest large growing economy over the period from 2009 up to 2021. We know that India overtook the UK as now the fifth largest economy, looking both at market exchange rates, but also in purchasing power parity. And if you were to look at what the upside potential is for India, so if India is now the fifth largest economy, if you were to look at GDP on a per capita basis, it's actually at the bottom of the G20 list, which suggests that there's still a tremendous amount of growth potential in India. So there's really there's no question as to why it has the attention that it does. You mentioned as well that India is for the first time host of the G20. The G20 is kind of understood to be the preeminent arena for convening on global economic issues. And so by being the G20 chair, that gives the country the ability to kind of set the agenda for what will be discussed in these sessions. So it has the potential to be a very important role. I think as Indonesia learned last year when it was hosting the G20, events often intervene, and what you plan to cover is not actually what you're able to cover. So Indonesia obviously was facing the crisis of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the fallout over that. I would say to Indonesia's credit, they managed at the end of their year to get the G20 back on track in the sense of having a wide acknowledgement among the G20 minus Russia, pointing the finger at Russia and acknowledging how destabilizing its action has been for the global economy. But that allowed the group to effectively turn the page in isolating Russia and then move ahead with India for its G20 year and actually set out its own agenda. So I'll kind of wrap up with my comments here and just say there are questions, I think, here in the United States about whether India's agenda will align well with what the US and maybe some of the other advanced economies would want. Any chair of the G20, India included, inherits a work program that their predecessors had put in place. So all the working groups are, in fact, functioning. India has a very ambitious schedule for convening those working groups. And so there's the potential, again, for some really constructive outcomes, in particular as relates to sustainable finance. That's been a priority. But there are going to be some real difficult issues. And here I would kind of flag two, and then maybe when we get into the Q&A, we can discuss a little bit more. But I would say India's outlook on trade is perhaps at odds with those who have been kind of champions of a more open trading system. And I would say even the champions of a more open trading system, we've seen some backsliding on that front. So I think trade is going to be a very challenging issue. And then second, I would say energy and energy transition and climate. I think it's very important that the G20 is focused on that issue. I think it's very important, and it's very good that India has demonstrated that it's made this a top priority. But what it wants, what other emerging market economies want relative to what advanced economies in the group want, I think could be an area of tension, also an area of opportunity. But let me stop there, Rick, and look forward to the discussion to follow.
Great. I'm sure we're going to pull that thread on the trade thing a little bit more too, with India hosting this the IPEF discussions in Delhi in the coming days. So great topic to kind of tee up for the Q&A period. Joydeep, let me hand over to you to get us started in the deep dive on India. Had a budget. We got a lot of other stuff going on, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. And thanks again for joining, my friend.
Thank you, Rick. And it's a pleasure being here again. Thanks for organizing this annual event. I work for S&P, so I should start my comments with a reference to the sovereign credit rating of India, and delve into some of the interesting points that Stephanie's also raised. We have India's rating at BBB-, which is at the bottom end of our investment grade category. And it's kind of notable that of all the countries that have an investment grade rating, India is the poorest. So the per capita GDP that Stephanie alluded to, if you look at that, the other countries that are close to India's level of income, but are also in investment grade, are all slightly more prosperous than India based on per capita GDP, countries like the Philippines or Indonesia. So there's an insight there to say, how does a country that is so poor on average based on per capita income attain an investment grade credit rating? Because generally speaking, wealthier countries have a higher rating on average. There are exceptions. And without going into all the gory details of our rating of India, I would say that, what's holding it back is largely a huge debt burden. The government's debt is over 80% of GDP. And also it's the per capita income being low. That's a negative factor. But what's holding it up, what's pushing it or has kept it in investment grade for many, many years, that is really the growth performance. Compared to other countries at a similar level of development, India has grown considerably faster and consistently over really since the early 1990s, with a few dips here and there. And so that's the positive part, the growth performance, and really everything hinges on that. The negative part being the debt burden. And the two are connected in a way that if you're looking at where is India heading, to the extent the growth story continues or even gets better, that's good for the country. It's also good for the credit rating, and that keeps the momentum in the right direction. It also keeps the debt burden under control and the fiscal dynamics under control, because growth just gives you more money. To the extent it doesn't happen, it's the other way around, that there's a problem with the growth story, growth performance, then you have the negative scenario where suddenly the debt becomes a bigger problem because it's harder to grow out of it, and you have to make other difficult sacrifices. So that's the rating snapshot of India. The fact that India is at this rather optimistic location globally compared with most of the countries of the world that Stephanie alluded to, that's not an accident. There's a reason why the country is there. There's a long-term reason in terms of its long-term growth performance. But, I would just go back to what the sentiment was a few years ago. India's growth rate had been declining a little bit, and actually was quite poor just before the pandemic. And there are many concerns raised at that point to say, look, there's a structural change in growth here. We've lost the golden growth path of 6-7%. We're much lower. And then the pandemic came, and there are also many doubts at that point to say, well, this is going to hurt again. And is the government's response to the pandemic adequate? And will we just see very low growth after the pandemic goes away? And there was a lot of open question, debate, and polemics as well on that issue. And I think right now we can see the story in terms of looking back. It's quite clear that certain things happened in the last few years, both pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, which explain the relatively benign picture we have today. I won't go into all the gory details of what happened, but I would just, mention a few things like basically house cleaning, getting your act together. The tax system, whether it's the value-added tax, the GST, or corporate income taxes, or even now with the personal income taxes, it's being cleaned up, it's being modernized, it's being improved. There are many things more to do, and the agenda is full. But basically, go back 5 years and look at the situation then and now. Clean up in the tax system, moving in the right direction. Same, I think, something that was done a long time ago, but which is really kicking in, is bankruptcy law. That basically now, if you borrow money and you can't repay it, there are real consequences. And For a long time, there weren't real consequences. As long as you borrowed from a public sector bank, they would write off the loan, and there'd be really no loss of control of your own business, even though you defaulted. So there are other reforms I could cite, but there are a few fundamental changes that were done pre-pandemic and carried on through the pandemic. And I would say even during the pandemic, there was a lot of criticism of the government's policy, especially by economists in the U.S. like Raghuram Rajan and Kaushik Basu and others, saying basically spend more money, spend more money. In retrospect, it appears that the Indian government had better advice and did spend more money, but not as much as it was told to spend, but spend it more effectively. So that means that today, the debt burden in India, although it's much higher than it was during the pandemic or pre-pandemic, is not out of control. It's still manageable as long as you have growth. The second thing I point to during the pandemic era is that, there's a saying, every crisis is an opportunity. You can't let one go without doing something good. I think India did make the pandemic into an opportunity for economic policy. And I would simply point to the structural change that the pandemic has told everyone we need to have new global supply chains based on different principles and different policies for obvious reasons. And I think India has made a very concerted effort to take advantage of the reshuffling of global production and supply chains. This is a work in progress. We won't know until a few years from now how successful it has been, but at least there are signs of progress in that direction. And I think this is a very clear statement that, in the past, if you go back 40, 50 years, there were many global trends and India missed the boat on some of those ones, going back especially to the 70s, 80s, and I would say even in the early 90s. This time, India is not missing the boat. India is on that boat. And I think that, combined with the other things I've said, set the stage for reasonably good economic growth in the coming years. The numbers, as people are banding about 6, 7%, with a little bit of more policy activity and luck, could be higher. So it's a relatively optimistic picture. I'll just point to two more things, which sort of, I think, underline the growth story. We're aware of specific reforms here and there, and the list of reforms is long, and some have been done, some have not been done. Probably the biggest drawback, I would say, is trade liberalization. I'm also one of the few part of the dwindling band of people who think trade liberalization is good, but we are on our way to extinction, I fear. But there has been a reversal of trade liberalization everywhere. I'm not sure the reversal is more dramatic in India or not, but India is in good company, unfortunately, on that issue. But leaving aside that, I think that the commitment to infrastructure and the improvement in infrastructure across the board is very, very good for growth and living standards in the future. And that's something physical. You can just see it when you land at the airport or you drive on the highway. And the second point, and I'll end with this, is something that doesn't get a lot of mention outside the country, and that's really state capacity. Can the government, central and state, can they actually deliver and implement what they were supposed to be doing anyways, what they were committed to do on paper? And I think I would just point to a couple of things on this. One is, last year, I believe, India's central government sent about $80 billion, US dollars worth, of transfers to people under various subsidies through the direct benefit transfer program. Now, if a decade ago, the government of India had to spend $80 billion on anything, you can imagine a considerable portion of that would have been wasted or stolen. Today, with the direct benefit transfer, at least it gets there. There may still be corruption at the grassroots level and all of that, but this is a huge improvement in the capacity of the state to deliver. And then if you look at other things, such as the number of taxpayers in the GST, it's now 14 million. In 2017, it was, I believe, 7 million. So, those 7 million added people who are now paying GST, most of them were around in 2017. They just weren't registered. And now they're registered and actually paying taxes. So across the board, whether it's looking at infrastructure spending or the tax network or delivering a basic service, there has been a fundamental improvement. There's a long way to go. There are many shortcomings, and and the story depends from state to state because not all states are the same. But I think the state capacity plus really a good growth prospectus political stability sets the stage for good growth. The caution I always add is that India's government debt is still over 80% of GDP. And that's not the good part of the story. It's not holding back the growth, but that is the problem. If growth slows down or something else happens, then suddenly we become much more concerned about that debt burden. But so far, so good. So let me turn it back to you, Rick.
Thanks, Joydeep. Yeah, there's a lot to kind of unpack there. The COVID is that pivot point for kind of economic restoration, infrastructure spending. A lot of great messages there. I'll just say for the audience as well, as we tee up our last of kind of the set speakers, if you have any questions that you want to pose, you can throw it in the chat box. There's a Q&A function there, or you can text me directly too. That works just as well. Christian, thanks again for coming in late at night Singapore time. But we always love and appreciate your thoughts and insights into what's happening in India. So the floor is yours.
Sure. I think we would agree with much of what Joydeep has mentioned. I think for us, I think, what is probably important is like how things are trending. And in that regard, the way the budget was sort of communicated with regards to ongoing fiscal consolidation is in fact a little bit positive from our end. I think there were concerns ahead of the budget announcement that perhaps this could be somewhat of a blowout, if you will, with regards to this being an election year budget. But indeed, even in the midst of a 0.5 percentage point consolidation as a share of GDP in terms of fiscal consolidation, there is still something for everybody, whether it's tax cuts or just a little more in terms of handouts for small to medium enterprises and corporates. There is something for everyone. So there is a balance that has been struck with regards to ongoing fiscal consolidation versus near-term support for the economy. Now, that is positive in the near term, but do we think that the 25-26 consolidation target, the primary balance, the sort of target with regards to the union budget deficit, is that still achievable? I think we still have some concerns about that, but yet the 0.5% percentage point narrowing in the sort of planned union budget deficit for 2024, I think goes to allay some of the concerns with regards to that commitment to fiscal consolidation. I want to highlight this because the fiscal sort of side of things is the main constraint with regards to how we see the sort of sovereign creditworthiness of India. We are very bullish with regards to the what we call economic strength. So the ability of India to perhaps attract more investments to really gin up growth over the long term in a sustainable fashion. That's probably not as controversial as the prospects for fiscal consolidation, as I had mentioned. So I think there is some of this positivity with regards to the messaging that's been put out by the finance minister when she said that she wants that 0.5 percentage points of GDP narrowing the fiscal deficits. So you are getting towards that 4.5% of GDP deficit target. But I think for us, while the 23-24 outlook seems somewhat assured based on the conservative assumptions of the policymakers, the subsequent years, how do you get to 0% from 4.5% in a span of 2 years is still a bit of a question. That doesn't necessarily mean a negative pressure on our current rating of Baa3, which is the lowest investment grade rating, but it does call into question about the prospects for further improvement of the Indian sovereign credit profile.
Thanks, Christian. I'm getting a few questions in already, but I had a couple that I know I wanted to tee up early on. Stephanie, something I alluded to, and maybe we'll come to you first, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I mean, you have seen, I think, a shift in India's policy towards trade, suddenly they're a little more interested in the last year and a half on signing bilateral trade agreements, and a little bit less elements, I think, of protectionism in the budgets than you saw in some of the Moody government's earlier ones. But IPEF, obviously a lot of conversation about that here in town, and India kind of staying away from the trade pillar there. But any expectations, or is it still a little bit early? But the sessions that are about to take place in Delhi, and this is a different kind of trade deal. So kind of taking even a step back from this negotiating session, how excited or muted are you when you think about the IPEF and its prospects?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. For those that don't already know kind of the lingo here and what IPEF is, it's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. It came about last year. It was launched in 2022. It's basically I'd say the U.S.-led attempt to make up for the fact that we pulled out of TPP, now CPTPP, and have not been able to kind of gin up the political will to get back into it. But there's also this recognition that the U.S. Ability to really engage in the region is very much dependent on economic linkages. And so I think the creation of IPEF is an acknowledgement of the importance of strengthening economic linkages within the region against the backdrop of a real skepticism toward trade, which is something that Joydeep had mentioned, maybe a global phenomenon, but certainly in the US, over the last, I'd say 10 years, there really has been a backlash against trade, which is problematic for the global system in general. As you mentioned, Rick, IPEF actually consists of 4 pillars, but India kind of stands out as a member of IPEF in the sense that it opted out of one of the pillars. So there's the trade pillar, that's the one that India is not a member of. There's a supply chain pillar, there's a clean energy pillar, and then there's a tax and anti-corruption pillar. So your question about the prospects there on trade, I would say not great, given the sense that India is not participating. And even within the trade pillar, there is market access is actually not part of that discussion. So it definitely is not kind of a trade agreement in the sense that we're used to thinking of. As far as the prospects in the other 3 pillars, I think it's there's potential, but it's definitely kind of a wait and see, in part because the agendas are really quite granular. And this is a large grouping of countries that have, different equities. And so just to take the supply chain example, is it realistic to think that we're going to have all of the countries in IPEF implicated in the supply chains? That's going to be very dependent on what product specifically we're talking about. And so, when I even think of how getting one's brain around what that negotiation might look like, there's going to be variable geometry as far as which countries are implicated in which supply chain for which product, depending on their comparative advantage. I mean, it's complicated stuff. So the issues, I think, are the right ones if you're taking trade off the table to focus on supply chains, energy, and digital. Those are the right issues. IPEF, in turn, is linked to other regional efforts, including in the Americas and with the EU. So there's, again, the potential to actually have something with a global footprint, but it's going to be a long-term agenda, and it's going to take a lot of work.
Thanks. Christian, let me come over to you. I mean, the news, a lot of which, other than the budgets, have been driven by Adani. And I don't want to put you on the spot necessarily to offer feedback on the reports and what's happening there. But, some of the chatter is about transparency. And I wonder, for you who studies, government data, but also you've got a lot of your own resources. What are the lessons you're kind of picking up from Adani? Or do you think this is just kind of a blip and everything will sort of continue on beforehand? So what any kind of major takeaways from what has been driving a lot of the news cycle in India of late?
Sure. Well, I guess firstly, the messaging from Moody's is that that Adani is big But the Indian economy, the Indian banking system, the Indian financial system is much larger. So from that sort of perspective, we don't necessarily think that Adani poses a systemic risk to the banking system, the financial system, the economy itself. Now, with regards to Adani in particular, I think we do think that I mean there are some sort of shortcomings with regards to governance, and that's already sort of built into our sort of assessment of creditworthiness here. I think, you know, there has been a general sort of improvement in regulatory quality, but that does still incorporate some shortcomings with regards to some sort of connected, you know, sort of lending. With regards to the sort of exposure, I've already mentioned that Adani, yes, it's a big company, but the Indian economy is much larger. But when we look at the sort of the banking channel, it looks like the exposures from individual banks are actually quite manageable. So they can kind of see through this sort of near-term stress that we're kind of seeing right now, and kind of focus on, like, you know, help their sort of developmental role in growing the economy. And indeed, over the past year, we've seen credit growth sort of pick up in a manner that we haven't seen over the past couple of years, given the sort of troubles that we saw in the financial system. So Adani itself isn't quite the sort of emblematic of the India story at large. You know, if you want to get into the details, if there was a situation where perhaps some of these sort of investment projects or infrastructure projects were to fall through in light of you know, some troubles with or stresses with regards to Adani itself. These projects were always seen as somewhat profitable and having sort of a significant value add to the economy. Certainly, I think our expectation is that other corporate players would sort of come into the fold, and so not really derail the sort of long-term development in terms of the value add of these types of infrastructure projects. So Adani itself perhaps is somewhat divorced. I wouldn't say totally insulated, but somewhat divorced from, like, how we kind of see India. And I think here I want to emphasize how our views on regulatory quality, which are quite pertinent in the current context, have always been somewhat lower than what we see in India's peers. And by that, I of course recall you know, places like China, where perhaps government policy is driven, you know, quite centrally, as well as those in Southeast Asia like India or Indonesia. So I don't think, in terms of a relative positioning, the sort of current episodes that we sort of lived through has necessarily led to a deterioration in our assessment of governance strength.
That's hugely helpful. I'll say, somebody kind of living the India lane full time, it feels like this has become more of a conversation about how you feel about the government and things like that, rather than a pure play look at what are the fundamentals behind what's happening and the impact. So appreciate that, Christian. Joydeep, my favorite topic, of course, is states. You hinted at it a little bit in your opening there. You've got 10 state elections this year. There's always state elections happening. You know, I think there's some great steps that the Indian government has done to devolve power to states to some extent in recent years. How does that, you know, when you think about, you know, ratings, when you think about the Indian economy, have you seen kind of a shift in the time that you've been, you know, tracking the India beat from S&P on more weightage applied to what's happening at the state level? Or is it still relatively kind of marginal compared to the things that are happening, you know, at the national level and by the union government? So can you give us some insights in that center state dynamic?
Sure. And this is a fascinating subject, and it doesn't get as much attention as it really deserves. You know, if you look at India's growth story, a large component of that comes from investment, mainly public sector investment into things such as roads and sewage treatment plants, things like that. If you get into the details, you find that the state governments collectively invest more money than the central government. And whether it's a share of GDP or absolute dollars, whatever measurement you use, the bulk of the investment is at the state level. And then if you look at just the general reform agenda, name like 4 or 5 things that India should do in the next decade to create a better life. Well, most of the infrastructure that has to be built is not going to be more national highways. It's going to be local roads, local sewage systems. You need to have electricity. Well, electricity is largely a state subject. And, there are problems with the electricity network and things like that, but those are very much driven by state policy. So I think increasingly as the national government, in a way, cleans up its act and does a lot of reforms, a larger share of the reform agenda falls upon the state government. So they are going to be driving growth or lack of growth in some areas. The other point to make about state governments is in the 14th Finance Commission about 7, 8 years ago, gave more money to the states. If you take the entire collection of taxes that the national government gets, a certain proportion is given without any strings attached to the states. The 15th Commission kind of walked that back a little bit. And there is tension now between the states and the national government. The states are saying, give us more money, but give us money without strings attached. And all central governments don't like to give free money. They want to have strings attached. This tension will be there. This will play out over time. But I think this is something to watch for, because increasingly India's development is going to be based on health, education, and local infrastructure. Those are state subjects or municipal subjects. The national government can only do so much, but the medical clinic down the road is probably going to be run by the state. So the good news is some states are on the ball on doing things. Bad news is other states are not. But that happens everywhere. It happens in the United States as well. And there's always going to be tension between the two levels. I just want to point out, since you mentioned elections, 2 things. One is we've seen in past elections that Indian voters are capable of distinguishing who they're voting for. So you may see a state election where people vote for one party, and then a national election soon afterwards where the mandate goes to the other party. People know who's running for what office. So you may see kind of split verdicts. The other thing that is interesting is that the cooperation between the states and the central government sometimes is surprising. You'll find an opposition state sometimes working very well with the Modi government, and another opposition state not working so well with the Modi government. We give the example of Orissa, led by a local regional party, working well with the national government, and West Bengal, led by another regional party, clashing with the national government. So there's a kind of a political dynamic which is very interesting. And luckily, it's not all black and white, which means that I think over time, there'll be more pressure on the states to deliver. And hopefully the national government will be releasing a little bit more free money so that the states can implement their duties.
Thanks. I'm going to pull a few questions from the Q&A box that we've got so far. First, Stephanie, green transition was brought up. We've seen, like with India, where a lot of pressure on India, some of these domestic production regimes and things like that. But at the same time, the DFC is putting 500 million to First Solar to build solar in India. So it feels like green transition, maybe warping sometimes some of the sentiments that we've got on what real kind of classical trade liberalization looks like. And you've got it popping up in almost every dialogue the U.S. is involved in, as obviously one of the drivers for international for the Biden administration. So how do you look at green transition, and does that have a warping effect you see on trade, or do you think we'll kind of come back on classical trade liberalization related to it?
Yeah, it's a great topic, an excellent question that was posed. I would say
we should have full 2 days just on this one, right?
Yeah, easily. Yeah, 2 years on this one, I think. I would say I mentioned, I think, tensions over energy transition, energy policy. I would say there's one very obvious near-term tension, and that is around the purchase of energy from Russia. That's a near-term tension that is also connected to the energy transition. So let me kind of focus on those 2 aspects. India has been very, I guess, transparent or forthcoming in its plans to buy energy at the cheapest from the cheapest source, and that happens to be Russia right now, that obviously flies in the face of the sanctions and restrictions that many countries, the U.S. included, has put on Russia. So there's an obvious tension there. I would say there's maybe also an opportunity there in that the largest purchasers of energy from Russia also have perhaps an ability to influence actions there in a way that the U.S. and other allies might not. And so I hope that that's actually not something that's squandered. But that's kind of the first near-term tension. On the longer-term issue of energy transition, I think the good news is that interests at a very macro level are aligned. I don't think there's any country that seriously doubts the need to speed the pace of the energy transition. That if we fail to do that, that the targets set in the Paris Agreement and reducing emissions are in jeopardy. So there's alignment on that issue, but then how you get there and who bears the cost of getting there, you have tensions. And I think in my comments, I kind of divided the world into the advanced economies and then emerging market and low income countries. The tension there is the advanced economies are saying, let's get going on this transition now. And let's go as fast as we can. And let's not produce necessarily or invest in new sources of emitting greenhouse gas emitting energy sources, versus emerging and developing economies are saying, well, we're in the climate crisis right now, not because of our emissions, but because of your emissions. And our priority continues to be on development. And so that's the discussion. I think the answer to that discussion is that those two issues, energy transition and development, are not mutually exclusive. And Rick, your program in particular has done a lot of good work on this issue of energy transition, and a lot of our programs across the center have. But I think the energy transition has to take place at the same time that we continue to invest in development. But the development dollars actually need to be spent in a way that is resilient to a changing climate. And so again, recognizing these tensions there, I think I'm on the side of speeding the transition. And I think there are ways to incentivize those countries that are still at lower income levels to also speeding that transition.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks. Joydeep, I think, if we would hold this conversation for 25 years, question of physical security would come up probably every second or third time. And most of that driven by maybe Naxals internal to India, maybe tensions with Pakistan. But more recently, you've had some border conflagrations with China. How much does that play in when you think physical security of India as a nation with its neighbors, or do you look at this as just kind of small things around the edges and unlikely in most scenarios to kind of build over into something that would be more destabilizing for the Indian economy?
It's more the latter. We haven't been emphasizing this in our work. I mean, obviously, we pay attention to it. The tensions with Pakistan have gone back a long time, and that's sort of been part of the rating. And what we've seen with the tensions with China, is perhaps more recent. But at the end of the day, it hasn't really had an impact on the things we're looking at. And we assume that they will not spin out of control and have a serious impact. I don't mean to downplay the impact from a strategic point of view, but from an economic point of view, it's not as if it's thrown off the fiscal trajectory or changed the development strategy. It has certainly had an impact on the whole geopolitical arrangement. We're talking about the trade initiatives and others that the whole Indo-Pacific, the whole word Indo-Pacific arose, you could say, in some ways, because of some of the fallout of the conflict along the border. But fortunately, this has not really had a negative impact on what we're looking at.
Thanks. Christian, something that came up a lot during COVID, and we had one of the questions pop up in the box, is about K-shaped recovery. Would that exacerbate? I mean, I personally saw, in India where a lot of techies were able to grab a laptop and work from home, and you saw very little impact in India on services trade. The high flyers but a lot more on manufacturing. The rebound economically overall has been pretty high. But how concerned are you that of this K-shaped recovery causing, exacerbating, I think, maybe tensions in India between the haves and have-nots?
No, I think it's worth noting that when you look at the labor market data, it looks like India has made like an almost full recovery from the COVID shock. But I think anecdotally, you would hear, some issues with regards to the labor market itself. So whether it's underemployment or something else, I think it is quite notable that perhaps that even though, let's say, seasonally adjusted GDP series shows that India has made a full recovery to pre-pandemic levels, there is this sense of like a bit of a damage or opportunity cost. You are still well under what would have happened in terms of the GDP levels as compared to, I think, what we saw with regards to the damage wrought by the pandemic itself. So there is that little bit of damage, and so I think we want to be sort of like cognizant of the sort of opportunity cost that it had led, not just from an economic perspective, but from a fiscal perspective itself. Now, I think with regards to your question on, I guess just ongoing sort of like impact. I think there is a sense of recovery, and we do think that the Indian sort of economic outlook is quite supportive, notwithstanding some of the economic sort of headwinds. I think we do acknowledge that there is a slowing of the external economies, whether it's from the U.S. or Europe on account of the monetary tightening and the impact of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So there is these external headwinds, but yet the domestic headwinds, whether you're thinking about the economic sort of consumption recovery or the investment recovery. We look at credit growth; it's still quite healthy, notwithstanding some of the issues that we're hearing that are hogging the headlines with regards to, let's say, Adani. That still seems to be quite intact. Yeah.
Thanks. A few questions came in regarding global supply chains and the evolution. And I think each of you touched on it just kind of briefly on trade policy and Joydeep on infrastructure, but let's hit it on kind of directly, starting with Stephanie. Is the draw away from China or the China plus one, friendshoring, all this stuff floating around, are you assessing, is it real? Is it actually happening? And which are countries that you hear about that have kind of been first in line? And then I'll ask Joydeep and Christian to comment on that from the India perspective. Is it meaningful for India to get that? Can they survive in the next 20 years without having a China-style manufacturing sector that's kind of taking off? And, Joydeep, you mentioned some of the infrastructure reforms. Are there other things you're looking for? Are the trade deals meaningful in this? Or can India have more of a services-led economy? So, Stephanie, give us a reality check on the China angle for that, and then I'll throw it over to Joydeep and to Christian.
Sure. Yeah, the supply chains issue is really an interesting one. You heard in the U.S., I think elsewhere too, this focus on supply chain security. And on the one hand, I think that's just a recognition of what we all saw, that excess concentration in a single supplier can derail production throughout the economy. So there's a focus on redundancy. And so I think maybe having a more diversified supply chain, I would put that in the kind of good lesson from the pandemic. And then I think there's the risk, and this goes to some of the earlier points in our discussion, there's the risk that the supply chain security is also hijacked by more kind of protectionist tendencies. So there's the potential that the supply chain discussion goes in the direction that is not actually helpful for trade. I tend to be an optimist by nature. So I think, I do think there are folks that are trying to harness this focus on supply chain security and redundancy that can accrue to the benefit of a number of countries, including India. We have already seen, there's kind of a strange dichotomy right now. We just got the trade numbers for 2022 and had record trade between the U.S. and China. At the same time that we actually also see in some of the data, and we hear anecdotally that some countries are shifting production outside of China. And, Vietnam is always mentioned as one of the biggest beneficiaries of that. So I think both could be true. I think long-term trend, we're seeing that, complete disengagement from China is not possible, is not going to happen. But will the trend favor a gradual, reduction of some of those economic ties and accrue to the benefit of other countries, the quote unquote friendshoring? I think we're already seeing that. And I think we'll continue to see it because, as we mentioned kind of in the previous round, there are a number of detailed economic dialogues that have a component that is intended to do precisely that. So I think we will see it. And I think this is a long-term project.
Thanks. Well, I'll turn it then over to Joydeep and Christian. Obviously, India wants to be that next best place and has dreams about 25% of GDP come from manufacturing. But in your perspectives, do they need it? What have they done of late? And what would you hope to see them do if you think that this is going to be a vital component? Joydeep, over to you first.
Yeah. I think the general impression I have is that this one is working for India. The production-linked incentive scheme, which was set up, just basically, for those who don't know, it's a series of subsidies to certain companies if they commit to produce a certain volume of output and if they export. It's basically giving assistance to get economies of scale and bring large-scale manufacturing to India, especially in electronics and certain key products. I think on the whole, the program has worked well. It's still early, but there are early signs of success. And I think it will be quite viable, partly because there is a local market you can sell to. You don't have to export everything. It's not a small country. And also because, there is good labor, there is good technology, and there's a dynamic private sector that can contribute to it. So, and finally, I should say there's been a very strong commitment from the government to do this. So you can see this at the political level as well as at the economic level, business to business level. There's a lot of effort to get that investment in. So I think that's the good news. The question mark or bad news potentially is to what extent does trade protection go along with this, as Stephanie was just mentioning. Yes, to some extent it's there, but is it going to get so big that it actually has an impact on the underlying competitiveness of the industries you're bringing in? I think so far the jury's still out on this, and the protection level there is still relatively manageable. Hopefully it doesn't get higher. The other issue is what will be the overall impact? It's one thing to say that the share of GDP that comes from industry and manufacturing will go up because you get all this investment. It's another thing to say, what about the share of the labor force working in those industries? Because, the world has changed, and the kind of labor-intensive, export-led development that we saw through much of Asia since the Second World War, technology has changed. We don't necessarily have to go through all of that again. And countries these days tend to have their peak level of manufacturing as a share of GDP at a much lower level than they used to in the past, just because we have newer things to do and new technology. So I think for skilled labor or semi-skilled labor, the scheme would be very good, and it will have a good impact on the labor market and overall macro numbers through trade, exports, GDP, things like that. But in terms of employment generation, I think for the low end, especially for the less skilled workforce, I don't see a huge improvement. I still think it's the Vietnams or Bangladeshis or some other countries of the world that are doing best at that end of the market. And that has to do with some problems in the Indian labor market, which we can get into. So I think so far it's on a good trajectory and it's likely to meet most of the targets. But I think if it has any shortcomings at all, it will be probably in the employment of unskilled labor.
Well, thanks. Christian, anything you want to add on this point on the evolution of supply chains and India's interest, ability, and need for this?
Yeah, sure. And I generally agree with a lot of Joydeep's points, but I think I would point to, the fact that, Indian policymakers are still wary of the competition from China. So that contributed to their decision to step away from RCEP, for example. Now, this may not look very material from a sort of like at a first glance, but when you think about the sort of general aims with regards to plugging into the regional supply chain, so it's not about delivering final goods to the US or Europe, but really participating in that regional supply chain along for example, electronics, where you need to get market access to places like Vietnam or Malaysia or the Philippines or Taiwan. Maybe Taiwan's not a good example, but the point here is that RCEP provided that sort of opportunity to provide those sort of greater linkages with regards to supply chain integration. But India, because of this sort of like perhaps superficial fear of sort of Chinese competition, had stepped away from that. So the way forward with regards to getting greater market share is going to depend on the way you integrate with the likes of Malaysia or Thailand or the Philippines or Singapore, not necessarily with the sort of these concerns with regards to China itself. The regional supply chain is very complex and very geographically dispersed. So, something like the sort of messaging that comes along with the decision to step away from RCEP does look upon somewhat negatively on those prospects for greater supply chain integration. Having said that, I mean, Joydeep had already mentioned this. The Indian market is huge. So, to the extent that investment can come in to sort of service that sort of very large domestic market, that can continue to sort of let power growth to a certain extent. But the sort of transition to the sort of more export-oriented development that we've seen elsewhere in Southeast Asia in particular, that seems to be perhaps a step forward that we're not currently sort of incorporating into our baseline.
Thanks. Well, we have a lot of questions that came in through the Q&A we're not going to be able to get to, unfortunately, but that's a great sign of a great event. One last kind of lightning round, maybe 30 seconds from each, but one other significant thing that is, I think, becoming increasingly well known is that at some point this year, and maybe right about now, India is going to surpass China as the most populous country on earth. And a lot of discussion in the past over whether this was going to be a drag on the economy. And of course, now with increasing economic prospects, is it going to be a demographic dividend? So let me first go to Christian, then Joydeep, and if Stephanie wants to add on this one too, just your quick thoughts. Is this just a number? Is it a good thing for India? Or is it going to cause increasing drag on the economy as we move forward? So the big news, India surpassing China, and what's it mean?
Sure. Well, I mean, this doesn't exactly sort of change things in a material fashion. I think we've always acknowledged that India is benefiting from that demographic dividend, in contrast to places like China and especially vis-a-vis advanced economies like those that we see in the U.S. and Europe. But I guess the challenge here is really that can India continue to sort of sustain job creation so that sort of demographic dividend doesn't sort of convert into a sort of a social risk. If you don't create enough jobs to accommodate this sort of additions, the marginal additions to the labor force, you will have a sort of social risk at your sort of doorstep. So I mean, so far so good. I think building upon my earlier comments with regards to economic integration vis-a-vis the rest of Asia with regards to RCEP, I think more can be done. But I think this is really more of a sort of political economy question rather than just something that is purely based on numbers.
I would say the glass is.
Yeah.
I would say the glass is half full, not half empty, and it's going to get fuller. yeah, I share the concerns that Christian has raised. Absolutely agree with him. But there has been an impressive improvement in, the gross enrollment rate for people in college age, in that demographic. Almost like 28% of people of college age actually go to college or university, much higher than a few years ago. There are other signs of improvement, but this is a big challenge because not only is India's population going to go through this demographic phase, as you mentioned, South India is more like China in the sense its population is growing much lesser and it's going to decline. North India is growing much faster. So there'll be a lot of internal migration and potentially some tensions there. Anyone who's skilled or semi-skilled, I think, has a pretty good shot. Next 10 years, things are going to be pretty good. It's the people at sort of the bottom, lower end of the market, not at the very bottom necessarily, but, people who have some education, but not very good education, who are really not employable. That's going to be hard. So I think this is a challenge, but so far, at least, I think there's grounds to be optimistic of muddling through.
I think your point before, every state in India is pretty much like a country too, and they're all going to go through this a little bit differently is a good bit of thought for that. Stephanie, anything you want to bring up on the demographic dividend or bomb point here?
Sure. Yeah, I agree with what both Christian and Joydeep just said. I think it's both kind of a challenge and an opportunity. And I would link that actually to something that Joydeep had mentioned about kind of the impact of technology on manufacturing and the fact that the technology itself has the potential to reduce the labor component. And so you need to partner the manufacturing policies with social policies that are capable of redistribution. And that's going to tie back to what Christian had said about kind of the risk for social spillovers from if that demographic dividend is not kind of channeled and if the resources are not distributed in a way that kind of maintains social cohesion.
Well, thanks. Well, this has been an invigorating discussion. I'd say it's as good as my morning cup of coffee. For Christian, it's probably about time to grab a glass of wine since it's pretty late at night Singapore time. But Joydeep, Stephanie, Christian, I can't thank you enough for taking the time. A lot happening in India this year, just on the edge of the budget, the G20, global supply chain shifts, and we tried to cover it all in one compact hour-long session. We'll come back again next year if everybody's willing to do it. I'll hold you all accountable and see if your any predictions you made came true. But really appreciate your time, and thanks to the audience for joining us today.
Great. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you.
Thank you.